Greetings, and thank you for joining us on the journey of Cracked Love Chronicles. From an early age, my existence was intricately woven into a tapestry of tradition and expectation, with a path laid before me that echoed the footsteps of those who came before. Being part of a lineage of entrepreneurs, I received more than just financial assets. I also took on the burden of high expectations. My family's empire, worth over $15 billion, represented more than mere commerce. It was an era of power and legacy. My father, Nicholas James Miller, has recently stepped into retirement, entrusting me with a firm handshake and a weighty promise to carry forward our family's legacy. I fully intended to follow through, at least for a time. My existence felt like a series of meetings, financial figures, and unyielding timelines. Then the incident occurred. The scene unfolded in a chaotic rush of piercing tires, breaking glass, and an abrupt, intense agony. The details are hazy, but the urgency in the voices of unfamiliar faces and the strobe of the ambulance lights linger vividly in my mind. Upon awakening in the hospital, I found my body in a state of disarray, yet my mind was sharper than it had ever been. Maybe it was the jolt of having made it through, or perhaps destiny was guiding me toward an unknown necessity. It was at that moment I encountered her, Dr. Maria Jones. She stood apart from the women I had encountered in my social circles. Maria exuded focus and confidence, showing complete indifference to my name or the wealth associated with it. She approached me as she would with any other patient, her manner composed, bordering on detached. It's etched in my memory, that moment when she stepped into my room for the very first time. Her serene demeanor enveloped the clinical environment. Her keen gaze evaluated me with precision, her voice direct and efficient. "Mr. Miller, you have a remarkable chance to be here today. However, adhering to the guidelines is essential for a complete recovery." Never before had anyone addressed me in such a manner. I was accustomed to receiving respect, even compliments, yet Maria's candidness captivated my attention. In the weeks that followed, during my treatment and recovery, I began to anticipate our interactions with eagerness. She would stop by to see how I was doing, her white coat flowing behind her, clipboard clutched in her hand. Her attention remained solely on my medical advancements, never considering my identity beyond the confines of the hospital. I held great admiration for her because of it. Initially, I attempted to win her over. It was instinctive, to be honest. A light-hearted remark in one moment, a perfectly placed quip in another. Yet Maria remained unaffected. She built a barrier around herself, one that I couldn't penetrate with wealth or influence. It simply fueled my determination to push myself further. After a while, I began to catch glimpses of the individual hidden behind the polished facade. Maria possessed a gentle spirit, though she concealed it skillfully. Her dedication to her patients was profound, and she labored relentlessly to guarantee they received the highest quality of care. One day, while discussing my recovery plan, I noticed her smiling at something I had said. It was short, yet it held authenticity. That moment filled me with hope. After my discharge, I mustered the courage to ask her out. To my astonishment, she paused. "Mr. Miller, I believe this may not be suitable," she remarked, her tone measured. I corrected her. "Edward. Kindly refer to me as Edward. It's merely dinner." Without any expectations, she acquiesced, albeit with some hesitation. The initial dinner was an eye-opener. Maria possessed a sharp wit, a delightful sense of humor, and an unexpected warmth that emerged when she finally relaxed her defenses. She shared her experiences navigating medical school, the challenges she faced as a newly minted doctor, and her aspirations to establish a clinic for underserved communities. Her enthusiasm for her craft was infectious, and I became entranced by her in a manner I had never felt before. Initially, our relationship faced its challenges. Maria was cautious, always pondering if we hailed from entirely separate realms, yet I was resolute. For the first time in my life, I found myself pursuing something, or more accurately, someone that seemed genuine. After a year of anticipation, we finally stood together, sharing our vows in a heartfelt ceremony that felt like a different universe from the lavishness I was used to. Maria appeared breathtaking in her understated wedding gown, her radiant smile illuminating the entire space. As I slid the ring onto her finger, I realized she was more than just my wife. She was my steadfast support, my companion, and my most thrilling journey. When Maria and I embraced the arrival of our daughter 2 years after our wedding, it felt as though life had completed its beautiful journey. She was our wonder, an exquisite fusion of the woman I adored and all the virtues I yearned to embody. Observing Maria hold our precious daughter was an incredibly heartwarming moment, one of the most beautiful I have ever witnessed. She went back to her duties at the hospital shortly thereafter, managing her responsibilities as both a mother and a doctor with a certain elegance, or so it seemed to me. For a time, everything felt just right. I managed the business, Maria took care of her patients, and we both treasured the time we shared as a family. Yet gradually, a transformation started to unfold. Maria began returning home later, her mind elsewhere, and her presence felt distant despite her physical arrival. I attempted to allow her some distance, believing it was merely the pressure from her challenging work. Ultimately, her unwavering passion for her craft was something I deeply admired. One evening, I caught a glimpse of her laughter on the phone, a sound that had been absent for weeks. When I inquired about it, she mentioned it was a colleague, dismissing my curiosity with a wave. It was a peculiar moment, yet I chose to move on. I had faith in Maria, yet the late nights started to happen more often. Our daughter started to wonder why Mama was absent for dinner, and the tension in our home intensified. It was during a visit to the hospital one afternoon, with the intention of surprising her, that I first laid eyes on him, David. His name struck a familiar chord with me right away. David was the former partner Maria had mentioned to me in the early stages of our relationship. The one who had abandoned her during her time in medical school, shattering her heart when she needed him the most. I embraced her while she shared those heart-wrenching memories, assuring her that she was worthy of more. And now, here he was, toiling away as an accountant at her hospital, sharing laughter with her as if no time had passed. That night, I faced Maria. "Why didn't you mention that David was at the hospital?" I inquired, my tone steady yet resolute. Her expression stiffened, and for an instant, I believed she might refute it. Yet, she let out a deep sigh. "It's really nothing to worry about, Edward. He's merely a co-worker at this point. The past remains in the past." "Could it be?" I responded, my irritation rising to the forefront. "It seems that recently, I'm vying for your focus against your work, and now, it appears, your former partner as well." Maria's eyes burned with fury. "That's absurd. You seem to be overthinking things. David holds no significance for me. So, what makes it seem like he receives more of your attention than we do?" I retorted. "You're hardly ever here, Maria. Our daughter longs for your presence. Your absence is deeply felt." That resonated deeply. She became defensive, claiming that I didn't grasp the challenges of her workload and the difficulty of managing it all. I made an effort to maintain my composure, yet the words flowed uncontrollably. It was as if she was gradually drifting from me, her laughter and words now exchanged with someone who had once caused her pain. "You shared all the ways he caused you pain," I replied, my tone gentler now. "I understand the challenges you faced because of him. And still, we find ourselves in this moment. Can you not perceive how this appears? What is my experience of this?" Maria's expression momentarily softened, a flicker of guilt crossing her face, but it was fleeting. "I have no say over who is employed at the hospital, Edward. I can't pause my career whenever you feel uncertain." "Feeling uncertain?" I echoed, bewildered. "This is not a matter of insecurity. It revolves around honoring one another. For my own purposes. For our loved ones. For the vows we exchanged between us." The disagreement intensified from that point, with each of us uttering words we truly didn't intend to express. Or perhaps we did, but the results were not as intended. Ultimately, Maria marched away to the bedroom, leaving me solitary in the living room, my heart heavy with frustration and pain. That evening, I found myself in the nursery, gently rocking our daughter to slumber, captivated by her small, serene features. I found myself pondering the fate of the life Maria and I had envisioned side by side. I cherished her profoundly, yet for the first time, I sensed a fissure in the very core of our union. A shift was necessary. We must discover a solution, or the gap between us will inevitably expand. The mere idea of losing Maria, of losing what we had, filled me with a sorrow that felt almost unbearable. The quiet that lingered between Maria and me had evolved into a unique form of communication. Chilling, remote, and weighty. Every day seemed to echo the one before. The long hours she spent away, the feeble justifications, and the widening chasm that formed between us. I held on to the hope that circumstances would shift, that Maria would recognize the impact her absence had on our family. Yet, nothing happened. One evening, following yet another late dinner in her absence, I finally reached my breaking point. As she stepped through the door, weary and detached, I knew the moment had come to engage in the conversation I had been avoiding. "Maria," I started, maintaining a calm tone. "It's time for a conversation. Is it possible to postpone this, Edward?" "It's been a long day," she remarked, gliding past me to set her bag down on the counter. "No, it cannot wait," I asserted with conviction. "This cannot continue indefinitely. It seems like you're hardly ever around these days. Our daughter is beginning to observe, Maria. She keeps inquiring about your absence." Maria pivoted, her gaze igniting with annoyance. "I'm giving it my all, Edward. My job is quite demanding, and you were aware of that when we got married. I chose not to marry someone who would place her ex-boyfriend and his issues above her own family," I retorted. That brought her to a halt. "Here we go again. Is this really happening, Edward? David has lost his wife, and his son is facing difficulties. What was I meant to do? Disregard that?" "Absolutely," I exclaimed, my voice elevating. "You are not his wife, Maria. You don't belong to his family. That doesn't fall on you. He is all alone," she snapped, advancing with determination. "You fail to grasp, Edward. David is struggling, and his son requires a sense of security. I'm merely attempting to assist, yet in the process, you're neglecting your own family," I remarked, my voice cutting yet measured. "Our daughter hardly gets to spend time with you. I hardly catch a glimpse of you. Do you believe that's just? For us? For her?" Maria raised her hands in exasperation. "This isn't centered on you, Edward. This concerns taking the appropriate action." "No, Maria," I said, my voice lowering. "This concerns your reluctance to establish limits. David isn't something you need to worry about. He made his decisions, and now he must face the consequences. You don't serve as his safety net." Her expression grew steely. "You're devoid of compassion," she retorted. "How can you stand there and express that when a child is at stake?" "I'm not devoid of compassion," I replied. "I have a pragmatic approach. The child possesses a father. David must take responsibility for his son and not depend on you to cover for him." Maria folded her arms, her gaze fiery. "If you could find even a hint of empathy, perhaps you would grasp the significance of this to me." "Understanding?" I exclaimed, filled with disbelief. "Understanding others doesn't require you to forsake your own loved ones for the sake of someone else. In your quest to rescue David, it seems we're being overlooked along the way. Can you even perceive that?" The confrontation escalated from that point, with each of us hurling accusations and frustrations into the atmosphere like embers dancing from a blaze. At last, Maria uttered words that pierced my heart like a sharp blade. "Perhaps envy is what you're feeling, Edward. Feeling envious that I'm prioritizing someone else's needs this time instead of focusing on yours." I gazed at her, utterly bewildered. "Envious?" I said again, my voice scarcely rising above a whisper. "This isn't about envy, Maria. This concerns the importance of respect. Honor for me, for our union, and for the life we've created together." She remained silent, arms crossed and jaw clenched, a picture of resolve. "All right," I finally responded after an extended, charged pause. "If that's your perspective, there's nothing further to discuss." I pivoted and exited the room, my heart constricted with a mix of fury and pain. That night, I found myself in the guest room, unable to muster the courage to share a bed with someone who felt so distant from me. As I reclined, gazing at the ceiling, a thought crept into my mind. Could this be the start of our demise? I cherished Maria deeply, yet affection alone couldn't bind us when she continually opted for another over her own family. Change was inevitable. I could no longer endure this way of life. Annie's 5th birthday was meant to be a celebration filled with happiness. I had meticulously arranged every detail to create a memorable experience for her, yet the day unfolded in an unexpected way. She awoke, her complexion ghostly and her energy sapped, her delicate form quivering with the heat of fever. It was evident that something was profoundly amiss. I attempted to reach Maria, wishing she would return home to assist, but there was no response. Naturally, she found herself at the hospital once more. I was filled with anticipation. I lifted Annie into my embrace and hurried her to the emergency room. While I lingered in the waiting area, cradling my daughter, I finally managed to connect with Maria. "Maria," I said, my voice strained with urgency, "I'm at the hospital with Annie. She is." Just as I was about to conclude, she cut in. "Ah, wonderful. It seems you've arrived ahead of time. Could you swing by the cafeteria and pick up some food for 3 individuals? David, along with his son and myself, has not had a meal all day." For an instant, I believed I had misunderstood her. "Excuse me?" I inquired, taken aback. "Just bring some sandwiches or something," she said nonchalantly, as if I hadn't just mentioned I was at the hospital with our daughter. The fury surged within me, swift and unstoppable. "Maria," I said, my voice icy and cutting, "do you even care why I've come?" After a brief silence, she responded, "Edward, I'm quite occupied right now. Could we have a conversation later?" I chose not to respond. I ended the call, my hands shaking with rage. Our daughter, was unwell, and all Maria could focus on was feeding David and his son? It felt as though the woman I had once known and loved was a stranger to me now. Moments later, the doctor entered the room. His expression was serious, and my heart felt heavy. "Mr. Miller," he started, "your daughter's situation is grave. Her kidneys are deteriorating. It is imperative that we initiate dialysis without delay, and a transplant will be necessary at the earliest opportunity." The words struck me with the force of a freight train. The room swirled around me, my breath hitching in my throat. "Oh, my dear, pure Annie, how could this be unfolding?" I grasped her delicate hand while she rested on the hospital bed, her complexion wan yet serene. My thoughts surged, a whirlwind of ideas crashing together in a chaotic dance. I had to remain resilient for her, to fulfill the role of the parent she required, particularly in Maria's absence. I felt the urge to reach out to Maria once more, to share what was unfolding, yet my frustration kept me from doing so. If she couldn't put her own daughter first instead of someone else's family, what was the purpose? As the nurses prepared Annie for dialysis, I made a silent promise to myself to do everything in my power to save her. She encompassed my entire existence, and I was determined not to let her down, even if it required moving forward without Maria. As I sat in the hospital room, observing Annie's delicate form connected to various machines, an overwhelming sense of helplessness washed over me, unlike anything I had ever experienced. My daughter, my lively and cheerful little girl, was now battling for her survival. The reality was harsh, and each moment felt like an endless stretch as I anxiously awaited Maria's call, yearning for her to grasp the seriousness of what was unfolding. As soon as my phone vibrated, I picked it up without hesitation, anticipating worry, perhaps even a hint of alarm. Instead, Maria's voice erupted through the line. "What were you thinking, Edward?" she exclaimed. "You brought me great embarrassment. David and his son were patiently waiting for their meal, and you chose to overlook them? What sort of individual behaves that way?" Her words ignited an inferno that was already consuming everything in its path. My jaw tightened, and I held the phone firmly, striving to maintain my calm. "Is that you, Maria?" I started, my voice soft yet quivering with rage. "Are you aware of the current situation? Are you concerned? You're the one who seems indifferent," she shouted in response. "Edward, you are being quite self-centered, constantly focused on your own needs." A sudden shift occurred within me. I rose suddenly, the chair screeching harshly against the unyielding floor. My hand clenched into a fist, and for a brief instant, the impulse to strike surged within me, yet I restrained myself. Taking a deep breath, I compelled my voice to remain steady, even as each word emerged with a low intensity. "Our daughter," I said with clenched jaws, "is in the ICU. Her kidneys are failing. She may not survive without a transplant, and as I strive to stay strong for her, you're preoccupied with feeding David and his son." For a brief moment, there was silence on the other end. Then Maria's voice cut through, sharper and more pronounced. "How could you allow it to reach this point? Edward, you are her father. It would have been better if you had recognized it earlier. This is on you." I gazed at the wall, my sight clouded by tears of frustration and weariness. "Maria?" I spoke softly, my voice trembling. "You weren't present at all. Do not even think about placing the blame on me for this." Our dispute escalated in volume until a doctor stepped into the room. He glanced my way and gestured for silence. I ended the call with Maria. The The silence enveloped the room once more, punctuated only by the steady beeping of the machines. I settled back into the chair beside Annie's bed, my head cradled in my hands. My heart felt burdened, as if it were being pressed down by the enormity of it all. I possessed an immense wealth, a treasure that could address countless issues. Yet in that instant, I experienced an overwhelming sense of profound poverty. No sum of money could restore Annie's health. No sum of money could mend the fractures in my marriage. And no sum of money could alleviate the profound guilt and isolation that enveloped me as I lingered there, hoping for a miracle. The atmosphere was thick with silence as my father, Nicholas, entered the room. His presence, as ever, held a gravity that commanded focus. He came toward me with a resolute yet worried demeanor, his keen gaze swiftly assessing the screens and devices connected to Annie. "How is she managing?" he inquired, his tone soft, nearly sacred in the face of such openness. I shook my head, at a loss for words. I pointed to the doctor who had been overseeing Annie's case. Nicholas inclined his head, moving to the side to engage in a discreet conversation with him. I remained by Annie's bedside, gently clasping her tiny hand, hoping with all my heart that we would find a way to overcome this challenge. Upon Nicholas's return, his demeanor was somber. "Edward," he said, settling next to me. "The doctor mentioned that her blood type is quite uncommon. Securing a donor will prove to be quite challenging." I acknowledged with a nod. "I'm aware." Their words echoed in my ears. A hush fell over the room before Nicholas posed the question I had been fearing. "Where's Maria?" I let out a quick breath, reclining in my chair. "Not here," I replied with a touch of bitterness. Nicholas arched an eyebrow, his expression inscrutable. "What exactly do you mean by not being here?" I conveyed my thoughts to him. I shared with him the details of Maria's ongoing absence, her fixation on David and his son, and how she had utterly deserted us during our time of greatest need. I held nothing back, the fury and disillusionment pouring forth like a river that had finally overflowed its banks. "As a mother," I stated, my tone icy, "she has not succeeded. Annie is here, battling for her life, while Maria is preoccupied with playing the hero for David and his child. She is so enveloped in her own sense of moral superiority that she fails to recognize the impact it has on her family." Nicholas absorbed the words in silence, his demeanor growing more resolute with each passing moment. Upon my completion, he released a measured, thoughtful sigh. "Edward," he stated, his tone unwavering yet infused with a hint of iron. "This circumstance cannot persist. If Maria does not place her family at the forefront, then it is time for you to take action." I acknowledged the situation, fully aware of the path I needed to take. I reached for my phone and dialed the number of someone I had complete faith in, Gabriel. "It's me," I declared, my tone steady and resolute. "I require observation on two individuals, Maria and David. I desire to uncover all the details, where they venture, their activities, and the conversations they engage in. Explore every possibility." As I ended the call, Nicholas cast a lingering, evaluative gaze my way. "You're on the right path," he remarked, "but brace yourself for what you may uncover." I took a deep breath, casting a quick look over at Annie. She was the sole source of my courage to confront this chaos. Maria's actions had created a chasm so profound between us that I doubted it could ever be mended. At this moment, everything else was irrelevant. My attention was solely on my daughter, and I was determined to do anything necessary to protect her, even if it required revealing a truth I wasn't prepared to confront. The day had already been laden with unease. Annie's condition remained unchanged, and with each hour that ticked by, it felt as though a blade was burrowing deeper into my heart. At that moment, Maria made the call. Without any introduction, she stated that David's son had been in an accident. "I am covering the costs of his treatment." Her tone was straightforward, as if it were the most ordinary thing imaginable. I tightened my jaw, striving to maintain my composure. "Maria," I inquired with a measured tone, "what makes that your obligation?" "Someone has to step in," she retorted sharply. "I cannot simply remain idle, Edward." I felt an overwhelming urge to shout, to express that her priorities were completely misguided. However, I did not. What was the purpose? Every debate with her seemed futile, and at this moment, my attention was solely on Annie. I ended the call in silence. That evening, the physician arrived to visit me. His expression was grave, and I instantly experienced a rush of both optimism and anxiety. "Mr. Miller," he started, "a kidney matching Angie's rare blood type was discovered." For a fleeting instant, a wave of relief enveloped me. At last, a moment of respite. At last, a glimmer of optimism. However, his demeanor shifted to one of gloom. "Nevertheless," he went on, "it was passed on to a different child. Angie was prioritized, yet one of her parents chose to have the kidney donated to the other child." It took a moment for his words to sink in. As they did, a surge of anger and disbelief gripped my chest. "Could you clarify what you mean?" I insisted. "Who was responsible for that transfer signing?" The doctor paused, visibly uneasy. "Your spouse," he remarked softly. "Maria?" The room whirled for an instant as the gravity of his words struck me. "Is that you, Maria?" I reiterated, my voice growing louder. "Did she really give away our daughter's kidney?" The physician acknowledged with a grave nod. "It was given to a boy named Alistair. His injuries were less severe than Angie's. Only one of his kidneys was affected, and it wasn't a matter of urgency." "What about your daughter?" "She requires a transplant urgently. I'm putting in every effort to discover another match." My mind was blank, my breath caught in my throat. Fury surged within me, consuming everything in its path. My hands clenched tightly, and I fought against the impulse to strike the wall. Maria had accomplished the unimaginable. She had placed David's son above our own daughter. Annie lay in the hospital bed, her life precariously balanced, while Maria had relinquished her opportunity for survival. Thoughts surged through me, fueled by frustration and sorrow. How was she able to do that? What sort of mother behaves like that? I gazed at the doctor, my voice quivering with barely suppressed rage. "Continue searching," I instructed, my voice sharp and terse. "Seek out another opportunity, pursue it with determination." As he exited the room, I took a seat next to Annie's bed, gazing at her delicate, tiny form. The fury and sense of betrayal seethed within me, yet alongside it flickered a fresh resolve. Maria had let Annie down, but I would not make the same mistake. I would do whatever it takes for my daughter, even if it meant dismantling the life we had created. Nothing else mattered in that moment but Annie's life, and I was determined that no one, neither Maria nor David nor anyone else, would obstruct my path. 5 days had passed. 5 excruciating days spent by Annie's side, witnessing her struggle for survival. The machines emitted a constant beeping, a somber indication of the delicate nature of her reality. What about Maria? She was absent. Not a single time. Each day, I reassured myself that she would arrive. She was compelled to. Annie was also her daughter. As the hours stretched into days, the anger and disbelief within me simmered, evolving into something more sinister. How could she possibly resist? How could she place anything or anyone above her own child? On the 6th day, calamity struck. The machines erupted in a cacophony of alarms, their frantic wailing causing my heart to drop into my stomach. Medical professionals rushed into the room, their expressions strained as they focused on Annie's care. I remained motionless in the corner, feeling powerless, with nothing to do but offer my prayers. Once they had her stabilized, the doctor took me aside. "Mr. Miller," he stated solemnly, "Angie's condition has deteriorated. She has fallen into a coma. We will keep a close eye on her progress." But his words faded into silence, yet I didn't require him to elaborate. "I comprehend." The struggle was intensifying, and Annie was faltering. I settled back beside her, my head cradled in my hands, a wave of sorrow enveloping me, a heavy burden that constricted my breath. Yet under the weight of grief, anger bubbled, intensifying with each fleeting second. At that moment, my phone vibrated. "Gabriel," I replied, my voice gravelly. "What is it exactly?" He started with a warning, and I could sense from his tone that he was onto something true. "Maria is dedicating considerable time to David. Excessive time. She is sharing a bed with him, Edward, nearly every day, and she's utilizing your funds to support his way of living." I held the phone with such intensity that I feared it would break apart. "Excuse me?" I whispered, my tone dark and menacing. "There's more," Gabriel went on. "The spouse of David. She passed away in a car accident, correct? I've been examining the situation, and the details are questionable, to put it mildly. It seems likely that David was involved in some way." My sight clouded with fury. The woman I had placed my trust in, with whom I had crafted a life, was deceiving me in every possible manner. She had forsaken our daughter, sacrificed her kidney for David's son, and now she lay in bed, quite literally, with a man who could very well be a killer. I rose to my feet, moving restlessly around the confined space. "Continue to observe them," I urged, my voice trembling with fury. "I desire to learn it all, each action they take." Once the call ended, I redirected my attention to Annie. Her tiny, still form served as a heart-wrenching reminder of all that Maria had forsaken. I had exercised patience. I made attempts to understand her perspective, striving to keep our family united. However, this was the final tipping point. Maria had deceived me, deceived Angie, and deceived our family. She had decided her path, and now I shall claim what is rightfully mine. Forgiveness was not an option. There are no opportunities for redemption. This had transcended mere anger. The matter at hand was one of justice for both Angie and myself. Maria and David were blissfully unaware of the impending events. However, they certainly would. Before long, the atmosphere in the hospital room grew chillier than it typically did that evening. Perhaps it was merely a reflection of my state of mind. I positioned myself next to Angie's bed, gazing at her lifeless, pallid visage. Each beep of the monitors served as a stark reminder of the delicate state of her existence. My frustration with Maria had simmered to a peak, yet I chose to conceal it, directing my attention to my daughter instead. As Maria stepped through the door, silence enveloped the room, and I chose to remain mute in her presence. My words were not meant for her. Nicholas, positioned by the window, cast her a glance that seemed capable of freezing flames. She averted her eyes from him. The doctor entered and reiterated Angie's deteriorating condition, even though we were already well aware. To my surprise, Maria finally consented to undergo blood testing. I failed to express my gratitude to her. That was the bare minimum she could offer. Ultimately, this was her child as well. Yet, just as swiftly as she arrived, she departed. There was no presence beside Angie, no tears to shed, no soothing words to offer. Silence prevails. She seemed to be in such a hurry to escape. As the sun began to set, the doctor arrived to share the news. Maria was a perfect fit. A glimmer of hope ignited within me, yet it was overshadowed by the burden of all she had wrought, or did not succeed in doing. Later that night, the doctor reached out to her, and I caught a snippet of their conversation. Maria's reply was as detached and methodical as usual. I planned to consult with Edward prior to reaching a conclusion. Before long, my phone vibrated. "Maria?" I responded, not from a wish to engage with her, but from a sense of obligation. "Edward," she commenced. Her tone was so nonchalant that it sent shivers down my spine. "Great news, I found a match." "I understand," I replied with a lack of emotion. "Indeed," she pressed on. "I'm ready to donate my kidney to Angie, but I have one stipulation." A harsh chuckle slipped from my lips. Naturally, she had a condition. "I need you to transfer $20 million to David," she stated. "In that manner, he and his son can enjoy a fulfilling life. That is my price." Her words lingered in the atmosphere, unpleasant and heavy. It was hard to fathom the words that reached my ears. Our daughter's life was at stake, and she was exploiting it to benefit her partner and his child. I remained silent. "Edward," she urged, as though anticipating my concurrence. I chose to end the call. I remained still, my hands balled into tight fists, knuckles paling to a ghostly white. The boldness, the harshness, it surpassed all my wildest dreams. Maria had indeed descended into the depths, and she was pulling our family along into the darkness with her. Yet, this was far from the end. Far from it. I would stand up for Angie. And for Maria, I would make certain she confronted the repercussions of her treachery. I lingered beside Angie's bed, the gentle hum of the monitors, the sole sound piercing the quietude of the room. Nicholas stood next to me, his unwavering demeanor a solid foundation amidst the turmoil of my feelings. Angie's delicate form rested still, a haunting symbol of all that was at stake for me. Suddenly, Maria entered the room. She appeared as serene as always, as though she weren't entering the room where her daughter was battling for her life. Her eyes glided across my figure, momentarily lingering on Nicholas, then returning to me. "Well, Edward," she stated, her voice sharp and professional. "Have you come to a conclusion?" I pivoted to confront her completely, my expression blank and unyielding. "Allow me to grasp this fully, Maria," I stated, my tone calm yet firm. If I choose not to pay, Angie meets her end. Our daughter has passed away. Are you suggesting that? Maria folded her arms, her face resolute and unwavering. The choice is yours, Edward. If you can accept it, then I can too. Her words struck me with the force of a blow to the stomach. Yet I remained unyielding. Is it possible for you to continue on without your child? I inquired, my voice tinged with a simmering intensity. She smirked, a wicked, disdainful curl of her lips. I'll divorce you, marry David, and have another child, she stated with a chilling detachment. The temperature in the room appeared to plummet slightly. For a brief instant, a thick silence enveloped the space between us. Then Nicholas advanced, retrieving a folder from within the depths of his jacket. I believe you've overlooked something, Nicholas remarked, his tone steady yet cutting. He presented her with the document, a copy of the prenuptial agreement she had signed prior to our marriage. Maria's complexion drained of color as she turned the pages. What is the meaning of this? She snapped, her voice quivering ever so slightly. It signifies, Nicholas remarked, as he retrieved his phone, that you've lost it all. He hit play on the video, and the space around him was suddenly alive with the vivid sounds and visuals of her and David entwined in bed. Her treachery, portrayed with striking clarity. Maria's complexion drained of color. You had me followed? She faltered, her poise unraveling. Nicholas remained silent. I didn't either. I gazed at her, allowing my eyes to convey the contempt and revulsion I felt. When I finally spoke, my voice carried a chill, almost devoid of warmth. Angie will survive, I declared, even if it requires the cost of another. Maria's eyes grew large, and in that moment, I caught a glimpse of what seemed to be fear. Yet, she remained silent. She had made her decisions that took her away from her family, from her child. And now, I shall claim what is rightfully mine. For Angie, I would go to any lengths. Maria and David? They were merely hurdles, and I would handle them as needed. This had evolved beyond mere vengeance. The matter at hand revolved around fairness. Concerning the safety of my daughter, I would go to any lengths to ensure her survival. I observed Maria exit the room, her posture upright, the sound of her heels echoing on the hospital floor, as though she hadn't just shattered everything we had created. Once she vanished from view, the icy, seething anger within me surged back to life. She was already en route to David, undoubtedly devising and strategizing her next step. I envisioned them side by side, murmuring in the darkness, each believing they had triumphed. They were mistaken. I had no intention of yielding, yet I was acutely aware of her next move. David, always looking for an advantage, likely suggested she file for divorce citing domestic violence, weaponizing my anger and prolonging the legal battle. They both believed they could control me, corner me until I was so desperate that I would have no choice but to give in. They failed to grasp the intensity of my determination. I was different from them. I refused to allow this to continue. As I stood there, a fire igniting within me, I realized the importance of being calculated. My daughter's life was at stake, and I refused to allow them to manipulate her any further. I extended my hand toward my phone. Gabriel, I said, my tone steady yet laced with an underlying threat. Dispatch the tailor. No further explanation was necessary. Gabriel understood precisely what I was conveying. He had been aware for years. The suitmaker was the ultimate solution for tackling challenges, addressing them when no one else was able to. It took everyone by surprise. As I ended the call, a feeling of dark contentment washed over me. The end was nowhere in sight. Maria and David believed they had the upper hand, yet they failed to grasp the true nature of their opponent. I would ensure they grasped the lessons. I redirected my focus to her. She required my presence, and that was all that truly counted. No matter the chaos around me, my focus remains unwavering. As long as she stands her ground, I will stand beside her. Maria and David were blissfully unaware of the impending events that awaited them. The lawyer's office exuded luxury, featuring sumptuous leather chairs and gleaming wooden furniture that captured the gentle radiance of the recessed lighting. The atmosphere was infused with a subtle blend of high-end cologne and freshly brewed coffee, while the walls were adorned with bookshelves brimming with meticulously polished legal volumes, each one gleaming in its own right. Maria and David sat before a grand, polished desk, the quiet between them punctuated only by the rare cough or the subtle shifting of their weight on the luxurious chairs. After 20 minutes of waiting, the atmosphere in the room thickened with an escalating tension that seemed to weigh down on everyone present. David reclined in his chair, arms folded, his gaze sweeping the room with a hint of annoyance. Maria leaned in, her hands gripping her lap, the tension evident on her face. The office door swung open at last, revealing a man clad in a crisp, tailored suit. Gregory Anderson. His presence instantly enveloped the room, radiating a sense of command and self-assurance. His gaze swept past Maria and David before he settled into his chair, foregoing any niceties. Gregory leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as he spoke. "How may I assist you today?" Maria inhaled deeply, her voice unwavering even with the tension twisting in her gut. "I wish to initiate divorce proceedings. In opposition to my spouse, Edward Miller." Gregory's eyebrows arched subtly at the mention of Edward's name, yet his expression stayed neutral. He rested his hands on the desk, leaning in just a bit. "Edward Miller?" he inquired, his tone tinged with a newfound wariness. "That name holds significant importance. What led you to the decision to divorce?" Maria paused briefly, then stated, "He's abusive. He has subjected me to both physical and emotional abuse. I'm unable to continue living with him." Gregory remained steadfast, yet he leaned closer, his intense stare fixed on her. "Is there any proof of this mistreatment?" he inquired with a cutting tone. Maria's expression hardened as she averted her eyes. "Indeed, I failed to gather any evidence. Fear gripped me. Fear gripped me as I faced the unknown." She cast her gaze downward, as though the confession pained her. Gregory appeared unaffected by her explanation. He remained patient, his eyes steady, until Maria at last raised her gaze. "Who is this individual?" he inquired, gesturing toward David, who occupied the seat next to her. Maria's voice took on a gentle quality as she looked at David, then shifted her gaze back to Gregory. "My name is David. He is my friend." Gregory's gaze sharpened just a bit. He remained silent for a moment, simply observing her. At last, he began to speak, his tone firm yet straightforward. "May I pose a question to you, Maria? Are you considering marrying David and benefiting from Edward's wealth? If that's your intention, I must be informed at this moment." The question landed with a jolt. Maria stood still for a moment, her complexion draining of color. She looked at David, then turned her gaze to Gregory, the gravity of his words enveloping her. David squirmed in his chair, yet an uneasy silence hung between them for what felt like an eternity. Gregory had more to say. "This is an important issue, Maria. Please be straightforward with me. Ending a marriage, particularly with someone like Edward Miller, is not a decision to be taken lightly. If your aim is to leverage this for financial gain, then I will not proceed with the case." Maria's eyes shimmered with an elusive spark. She felt a surge of guilt, fear, or maybe something entirely different, yet she swiftly concealed it beneath a veneer of forced tranquility. "I'm not after his money," she said swiftly, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. "I simply wish to distance myself from him. I desire my independence." Gregory observed her intently for a brief moment, his face a mask of mystery. He was skeptical, yet he chose not to press the issue any further. He reclined in his chair, letting out a sigh, as though he were contemplating the matter with great deliberation. He finally said, "I need to discuss this with you further. I will examine your situation, but it's important for you to realize that if I proceed with this, it will not be a swift or simple journey. I must understand that you are devoted to the truth, Maria. Honesty is key, no tricks involved." Maria nodded swiftly, the urgency creeping back into her tone. "I comprehend. I'm really in need of assistance." Gregory rose, marking the conclusion of the meeting. "I will reach out shortly. I will reach out once I have had the opportunity to assess your case thoroughly." He glanced at David, then shifted his gaze back to Maria. "Wishing you well, Maria." As they exited the office, the gravity of the discussion lingered in the atmosphere. Maria sensed the palpable tension that hung in the air between her and David. The resonance of Gregory's words lingered in her thoughts. Yet, she was resolute. She stood her ground. Not at this moment. Not when all her desires lay just a breath away. Maria and David occupied the living room of David's apartment, the atmosphere heavy with unease. The tension had been escalating for days, with both individuals becoming increasingly exasperated with each tick of the clock. The gentle murmur of the city beyond seemed like a fading recollection, overshadowed by the severity of their exchanges. David pounded his fist against the armrest, his face burning with fury. You mentioned that Edward would give in. You assured me he would provide us with what we desire. What's holding him back from making a move? His voice cut through the air, laced with irritation. Maria's expression stiffened, yet she swiftly concealed it with a rehearsed smile, striving to take charge of the dialogue once more. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, exuding a relaxed demeanor that masked the intensity burning within her gaze. He's merely putting up a front. He puts on a brave face, but I see right through him. He will yield in due time. All I need to do is let my allure shine, and he'll be putty in my hands. David cast her a doubtful glance, his hands placed on his knees as he leaned in closer. Allure? Do you genuinely believe that's going to be effective? He's not foolish. He possesses great strength, Maria. What if he has simply moved on from you? Maria's eyes sparkled with intensity, her simmering frustration just beneath the surface. Believe me, David, she murmured, her tone soft yet menacing. Edward easily gives in when it comes to my requests. He has always been that way. It's only a question of when he will give in. I understand precisely how to provoke him, how to instill a sense of guilt within him. He lacks strength, particularly regarding his daughter. I'll leverage that against him, just as I have in the past. David's jaw tightened. Do you really believe he will allow you to take advantage of him in this way? Following all that has transpired? Maria let out a soft sigh and reclined, as though the burden of the discussion was merely a trivial annoyance. It's not about stepping on him, David. It's about helping him understand just how essential I am to him. He desires for Angie to endure, and I am the sole person capable of ensuring that occurs. Her voice took on a gentle quality, yet her eyes grew steely as she mentioned their daughter, Angie. I hold the reins in this situation. Edward is determined to ensure her survival, even if it requires him to concede to our demands. David paused, his gaze fixed on her with intense scrutiny. He yearned to trust her. He hoped that Maria's skill in navigating the circumstances would prove effective. Yet, as he pondered further, doubts began to creep in about their actual grip on the circumstances at hand. Maria's voice sliced through his thoughts, fluid and assured. Edward believes he holds the advantage, yet he does not. He consistently gives in when it counts. Years have been devoted to understanding him, uncovering the intricacies of his motivations, and when the moment arrives, he will find himself without options. I'll have him completely under my control, pleading for my assistance to rescue his daughter. David locked eyes with her, his gaze sharpening. Are you certain about that? Maria smiled, a deliberate, thoughtful smile. Believe me, David, I have a clear understanding of my actions. Edward Miller stands no chance against me. David remained skeptical, yet there was an undeniable spark in Maria's gaze, a fierce assurance, that caused him to hesitate. She had always possessed the skill to achieve her desires, and if her instincts about Edward were correct, if she could once more bend him to her will, then all they sought would be attainable. For a fleeting instant, David permitted himself to embrace the possibility of Maria's vision. Perhaps she could persuade Edward to relent, and when that occurred, they would finally attain all they had been striving for. David and Maria lingered just beyond the hospital's entrance, the air fresh and invigorating, the city's vibrant sounds enveloping them as they made their way to their car. The burden of recent days weighed heavily upon them, yet a flicker of hope lingered in the atmosphere. David's son was finally discharged, marking a significant step forward in their quest for what they desired. All appeared to unfold as intended. While they strolled, a man came toward them. His attire was unremarkable, merely a plain jacket and jeans, yet there was an undeniable quality to his presence that was striking and intentional. He addressed David first, his words laced with a rich Spanish accent. "Excuse me, gentlemen, may I pose a question to you?" David cast a fleeting look at Maria before shifting his gaze back to the man. His curiosity reached new heights. "Absolutely," David responded, his demeanor relaxed yet cautious. The man offered a faint smile, yet his eyes stayed icy. He assessed David from head to toe, then turned his attention to Maria. His gaze rested on her for a brief moment, as if assessing her presence. Then, without skipping a beat, he continued, his voice gentle yet unwavering. "Are you a fan of soup?" David's expression darkened, a look of perplexity creasing his forehead. The inquiry felt oddly positioned, too peculiar to be anything beyond a jest or an awkward effort at casual conversation. He stepped back, a sense of unease churning within him. He shared a glance with Maria, who mirrored his confusion. Before either of them had a chance to reply, the man's attitude changed dramatically. His gaze hardened, and he discreetly slipped his hand into his jacket. David felt an urgent compulsion to act. Yet, before he had a chance to respond, the man found himself accompanied by a group of others, swift, stealthy, and remarkably effective. They advanced swiftly, encircling the duo with almost no noise. One of the men, a robust figure with a piercing stare, drew a pistol and aimed it straight at David. "Approach the van," the man commanded with a chilling tone, his voice steady and unyielding. "Stay indoors, just like a well-behaved companion." David felt a surge of adrenaline, his thoughts battling to make sense of the unfolding chaos. He sensed the tension in Maria's arm next to him, yet he could also perceive her uncertainty. Outnumbered and facing the cold steel of the man's gun, any thought of resistance felt utterly futile. David looked down at his son, who stood a short distance away, his expression one of paleness and bewilderment. The men appeared to sense the uncertainty in David's stance, and one of them flashed a disquieting, jagged smile. "Are you looking to safeguard him?" The man spoke, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He inclined his head just a fraction, a wicked grin dancing across his lips. "He won't be thinking of you, I assure you." The words struck David with the force of a gut-wrenching blow. His heart sank, and a chill coursed through his veins. His son, the singular focus of his heart, was in peril. The danger loomed large, casting a shadow of dread that enveloped him completely. His son's safety was now intricately linked to each of his actions. David took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on Maria, silently urging her to comprehend his feelings. She gave a subtle nod, her expression tightening with resolve, and gradually, the two of them started making their way toward the van. The men maintained their distance, yet their presence loomed heavily, and each step toward the van felt like a march toward an uncertain destiny. The van came to an abrupt halt, the engine humming softly while the outside world held its breath. The silence was unsettling, a stillness that seemed to promise something ominous lurking just beneath the surface. The men emerged from the van first, then pivoted to compel David and Maria to exit. The atmosphere was moist, the heavens laden with ominous clouds as they strolled along the untamed dirt trail. The barn ahead stood like a specter, forsaken and formidable. David struggled to calm his breath, yet every step seemed to pull him further into an uncontrollable abyss. Maria walked alongside him, her complexion wan, yet she remained silent. The men guided them into the barn, their footsteps resonating in the empty expanse. The scent of hay mingled with rust, and the atmosphere was heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. Upon stepping into the shadowy barn, the mysterious figure guiding them pivoted, his icy gaze sharpening as he regarded them. "I wish to invite you into my kitchen," he remarked, his tone laced with a disquieting serenity. "However, this is the USA, not Mexico. It's quite challenging to create a kitchen in this space. Moreover, we must act swiftly." David experienced a shiver run down his spine, yet the man appeared completely unaffected. He retrieved an iPad from his jacket, his expression darkening as he tapped the screen with evident annoyance. "Text, this technology business really gets under my skin," he grumbled, "yet here I am, with a task at hand." He initiated the call, and before long, the recognizable visage of Edward materialized on the screen. The moment David laid eyes on Edward's face, a wave of shock washed over him. But before he could fully comprehend the situation, the man pivoted the iPad in Maria's direction. Edward's voice crackled through the speakers, his words slicing through the tension in the barn with precision. "Greetings, Maria." Edward's voice remained unwavering, frigid. "Before you inquire about what is occurring or the reasons behind it, allow me to provide some clarification. I'm simply rescuing my daughter. As I mentioned, she will survive, even if it requires the cost of another. When you requested money to save the child you bore, you turned your back on her and relinquished your role as her mother. The communication was unmistakable. This was not driven by vengeance or rage. The mission centered on rescuing Angie, no matter the sacrifice required. Edward's voice carried on, shifting its attention to David. David, I will handle Alistair. He will thrive without you as a father. I won't be the one to raise him, but I will ensure that he is brought up properly. However, I will inform him that you were an inadequate father, a disappointing individual. You negotiated for cash while someone was on the brink of death. I trust you enjoy soup. David felt a fog settle over his thoughts. He had become so engrossed in the notion of engaging in the game, negotiating for his desires, that he hadn't genuinely contemplated the repercussions. At this moment, everything became evident. Edward had meticulously crafted his next strategy, and it was merciless. There would be no opportunities for redemption. Maria's expression contorted with fury as she absorbed Edward's remarks. But that fury swiftly morphed into bewilderment when she shifted her focus back to the man clutching the iPad. The men surrounding them remained observant, their demeanor icy and mute, as if anticipating an event to unfold. Suddenly, one of the men advanced and seized Maria by the arm. Before she had a chance to respond, another man brandished a syringe and administered an injection into her arm. Maria's body went slack in an instant, her eyes fluttering as the surroundings began to fade into a haze. The men sprang into action, swiftly hoisting Maria onto the stretcher and hurrying her to a secluded spot in the barn. The atmosphere became increasingly dense with each stride, as though the barn were pausing in anticipation. The shadows enveloped the space, creating an atmosphere that weighed heavily on David's senses, leaving him momentarily questioning whether he was truly awake or ensnared in a haunting dream. He hardly noticed the noises surrounding him, his thoughts a chaotic storm of rage, bewilderment, and dread. The individual who had previously been gripping the iPad, the one responsible for presenting Edward's remarks, pivoted to confront David with a chilling grin. "Where have my manners gone?" he inquired, his tone fluid yet tinged with a disquieting serenity. "I am Santiago Meza Lopez, the tailor, or El Pazolero, whichever you fancy." He took a brief pause, allowing the name to linger in the atmosphere like a delicate thread, ready to break with the slightest misstep. "Allow me to speculate. You play the role of the admirer, while she embodies the spouse." Or, he glanced over at Maria, who lay motionless on the bed. At the very least, she held the title of wife. David's heart raced, his body tense with apprehension. The man's laid-back demeanor suggested that this was merely another ordinary occurrence in Santiago's bizarre reality. Santiago's smile remained steadfast as he turned his attention back to David. "You don't have to meet your end here," he said, his voice slicing through the atmosphere with precision. "Travel is still necessary. Please follow my instructions, if you would be so kind." With a discreet flick of his hand, the men encircling David advanced swiftly. Before David had a chance to respond, they grabbed him, pulling a dark bag over his head. He battled them, a wave of panic coursing through his veins, yet it was in vain. The bag enveloped him in shadows, while the ropes that swiftly secured his wrists and ankles rendered his efforts futile. He was hoisted from the earth, his form contorted in a grotesque manner, the bindings biting into his skin with each motion. The sound of footsteps reverberated through the air as they pulled him away from the place where Maria lay in a deep, unyielding slumber on the bed. A wave of helplessness engulfed him, while the piercing sting of humiliation left a profound mark. He had become merely a tool in their eyes, something to be exploited and then thrown away. David attempted to speak, but his voice was obscured by the bag. "What is it that you seek from me?" The sound of Santiago's laughter reverberated through the shadows. "You'll discover it in due time. Just relax and enjoy the ride," he said, a playful lilt in his voice. The men continued onward, unwavering in their resolve. No response was given. With each step, David felt himself being pulled deeper into the void. As the men persisted in pulling him along, every thought was overshadowed by the unyielding thrum in his chest. Whatever lay ahead, it was beyond his grasp. I remained in the bright, clinical hospital corridor, my hands neatly clasped before me. The doctor's words reverberated in my thoughts, yet they seemed empty, far away. 2 kidneys, he had remarked, as though it were merely a routine medical procedure. As though there was any semblance of normalcy in this. as though we hadn't just crafted something sinister and complex to protect my daughter. The doctor beamed, his enthusiasm bordering on excessive, as if he reveled in the agreement we had reached. Not merely one, Mr. Miller, but a pair of kidneys. Your daughter now has a strong opportunity ahead of her. This is truly exceptional. I nodded absent-mindedly, my gaze drifting toward the door of the operating room. In the background, Angie was probably getting ready for surgery, the gentle buzz of machines and distant murmurs seeping through the walls. Yet, I found it impossible to experience any sense of joy. Not at this moment, not after everything that transpired. She deserves to, I whispered, my voice scarcely rising above a murmur. It transcended a mere declaration regarding her well-being. It encompassed all the events and choices that brought us here, regarding the lengths I had gone to ensure her survival, and regarding the price of that existence. Nicholas stood beside me, quiet yet understanding. There was no need for words. His smile conveyed it all. He grasped the cost we had borne for those kidneys. He was fully aware of the steps we needed to take, the lengths I went to in order to obtain them. Retreat was no longer an option. The agreement was finalized, and the repercussions would ensue. At this moment, Angie was the only thing that truly counted. Only her survival mattered. Thoughts of Maria danced through my mind. She had departed, just as intended, and now, she would never lay eyes on Angie again. A peculiar sense of clarity washed over me with that realization. I had ensured it. Maria had forsaken her child, while I had taken every measure to protect my own. The world might judge me harshly for my actions, yet I stood firm in my decision. Angie was under my care, and I would not allow anyone to take her away, not even her own mother. The doctor went on discussing the procedure, emphasizing the challenges of recovery, yet his words seemed to drift into the background, lacking significance. Angie occupied that room, and I was the catalyst for her opportunity. I glanced over at Nicholas. My gaze grew steely as the gravity of my actions began to sink in. She'll live, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper, directed more inwardly than to anyone around me. Indeed, Nicholas responded, his grin unwavering. The arrangement was quite favorable. I understood that my actions would linger in my mind for all time. At this moment, it was of no consequence. Angie existed. That was everything I required to concentrate on. I approached the door of the operating room, preparing myself for whatever awaited me on the other side. The battle was far from finished. There remained a multitude of tasks ahead, a plethora of choices to consider. Yet at this instant, I possessed one. I rescued my daughter. At this moment, that was everything that counted. In a distant, softly illuminated kitchen nestled within a remote farmhouse, Santiago Meza Lopez found himself standing before a sizable pot. The dance of the flames created elongated silhouettes throughout the space, while he meticulously mixed the ingredients with careful attention. His hands moved with precision as he crafted the latest batch of pozole, the renowned soup that had earned him a reputation. This time, though, the components were far from what one might typically anticipate. David lay in fragments nearby, his existence now offered up for the game Santiago engaged in. A battle of dominance, manipulation, and retribution. Santiago smiled to himself, his thoughts distant and frigid as he pressed on with his work. The deep, fragrant aroma of the soup enveloped the room, and it was more than just the spices that hung in the atmosphere. It was an ominous presence, a shadow lurking with malevolence. His pozole transcended the mundane, and this evening, it promised to be even more delightful. Ultimately, it was inevitable. In a distant realm, untouched by the terrors Santiago was weaving, the fate of a child's life teetered precariously. Angie, the daughter of Edward, had just stirred from her slumber. The journey had been arduous, yet the doctors remained optimistic. The endeavor had proven to be triumphant. The two kidneys were an impeccable fit, and her body was reacting favorably to the transplant. Her delicate, fair face stirred with the hints of revival as she gradually opened her eyes, squinting against the harsh brightness of the hospital room. The physician lingered next to her bedside, his expression glowing with a careful sense of hope. "She has awakened," he declared, his tone infused with a sense of relief. "The kidneys are an ideal match, Mr. Miller. Her body is reacting positively. We remain optimistic about her full recovery and trust that her body will embrace the kidneys." Edward lingered at the foot of the bed, his gaze unwavering as it rested on his daughter. After what seemed like an endless stretch of turmoil, a feeling of tranquility finally emerged. A triumph against all odds. He had battled for this moment, sacrificed so much, and now Angie was alive, her prospects for recovery brighter than they had been in days. Edward offered a tired yet sincere smile. Absolutely, the body will definitely embrace it. The phrases emerged with certainty, each one heavy with significance. The journey that brought him here, the efforts he invested, the sacrifices endured, it all culminated in this singular outcome. Yet, hidden behind that smile, shadows remained. He couldn't shake the memories of what had transpired with Maria and David, how they had attempted to manipulate his daughter's life, reducing her to mere leverage. His daughter was alive. Alistair, the boy who had once been under Maria's watchful eye, was now distant, embarking on a new journey with a couple without children in Mexico. Gabriel ensured that the child would be cherished, nurtured, and brought up as part of their family. The commitment was honored. Alistair found himself in a place of safety. However, David was destined to wander in turmoil forever. His body had become an integral element of Santiago's chilling legacy. The stain of treachery marked the hands of all who participated, yet Edward stood triumphant. He gazed down at Angie, her breathing now more even, and gently swept a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "You'll be okay now," he murmured gently to her, as if addressing the very cosmos. He had chosen wisely. Regardless of the price he had to pay or the shadows he needed to confront, he was determined to shield his daughter with every ounce of his being. Amidst the cacophony of the hospital, Edward's heart raced, caught in a tumultuous blend of relief and guilt. He had accomplished what was necessary, yet the inquiries, the decisions, the consequences, they would all linger in his mind. One day, Angie would have her own questions to ponder. For the moment, she was secure. And that, he mused, was the sole thing of significance. After 2 weeks, Edward initiated divorce proceedings on the grounds of abandonment and was ultimately granted a divorce after a year had passed. Maria's whereabouts were a mystery, and the indifference was palpable. Esteemed audience, we invite you to express your insights in the comments section below. Also, kindly remember to like, share, and subscribe.